It merits its own conversation, but so let's get to the integral. So the harbingers of tomorrow, the evidence of transformation, and other signs of the new and imminent cannot have gone entirely unnoticed. Gebser talks about time and the concretion, which is sort of the realizing time in our consciousness, as being sort of what the integral is all about. It has to be concrete and never merely abstract. So art is a perfect way to kind of concretize something in you, truly embody it and express it. So when he says by integration, we mean a fully completed wholeness, the bringing about of an integrum, the reestablishment of the inviolate and pristine state of origin by incorporating the wealth of all subsequent achievement. This means that the various structures that constitute him must become transparent to him. This is very important. All of the structures we've been talking about, all of the perspectival or aperspectival or unperspectival, all of those relations to time and space and spiritual constitution have to kind of come online. And you're not necessarily going to be on one side or the other, but the whole thing is transparent. The integral human being is the whole human being. So, the integral structure, it brings all the structures online. It concretes time. And if the mental was a triangle, the integral is a sphere, a transparent sphere. Not a circle like the soul, but a sphere. And if the mental was rational wakefulness, and of course the magic and the mythic were kind of like a dreamy twilight consciousness, the integral is irrational lucidity, diaphanous and present. And a lot of these terminologies, one of my colleagues, Aaron Cheek, he's done some interesting work here comparing the integral to some insights, spiritual insights in Tibetan Buddhism, and the kind of like clear light consciousness and that kind of thing, or sort of the lucidity that you develop and cultivate through lucid dreaming. It's this kind of seeing through not just waking consciousness, but also dreaming consciousness. It's sort of both. It doesn't privilege one or the other. And of course, I mentioned the fourth dimension, which is time. So he's talking about the perspectival age and how it meant nothing but measurements and relationship between two moments. 1 second, then the next second, and the next second. To the perception of the aperspectival world, time appears to be the very fundamental function and to be of a most complex nature. It manifests itself in accordance with a given consciousness structure as clock time, natural time, cosmic or sidereal, biological duration, rhythm, meter, mutation, discontinuity, relativity, as vital dynamics, psychic energy, as mental dividing. So he's kind of giving you this sort of list, this kind of like stream of consciousness list of all of the different temporal structures of consciousness that are through the archaic magic and mental. It's all of those things.
Can you go back one screen for me just
Sure.
a moment?
Yes.
Is that the one before it?
This is talking about the mental, wakefulness, lucidity, and this is the quote.
Where it was defining the integral, it was actually the page just directly preceding where it was on.
This one?
No, so they've been there. Well,
This is the top.
It's more of a direct definition of the integral perspective, so to speak. You know, positioning it aloof any other in a sense, in that sense. I'd like to pick it out. Please go ahead.
Okay. All right. So again, he's talking about what is prepared for is more than a mere concept of time. It is the achronon, meaning atemporal, right? Time freedom and liberation from every temporal form. But it doesn't mean you escape them. It doesn't mean you're no longer in time. There's just an aspect of you that is free through time and beyond time. So, the courage to accept, along with the mental time concept of efficacy, of the pre-rational, the magical timelessness and irrational, the mythic temporality, makes possible the leap into irrational time freedom. This is not freedom from the time forms, since they make us up, right? It is to begin with a freedom for all time forms. It's what generates all of the structures of consciousness in which we are all a part of. Yes, and so it can bring about a conscious advance or approximation to origin. So he's really talking about this originary consciousness sort of realized in the human being, realized through history, but not limited to history, not limited to the structures. So again, it's a very kind of mystical insight, which is probably why he wasn't read alongside more of the material, pessimistic, postmodern thinkers. So this kind of is just this is what you have on the sheet, and this is kind of just the broad brush of the structure. Helpful
he dies
image.
In 75?
73. Helpful image, the zero dimension, point, circle, triangle, pre-temporal.
Oh, that was nice.
And then timelessness, so the time, and then the kind of equality of each of the structures. So with the archaic, it is kind of integral. It is that kind of unity before differentiation. And the integral afterwards, the integral structure itself, is that unity, but through all of the differentiation. All that has emerged and been seen through. So there's a kind of sphericity to this whole story that we're talking about. The image of what we're saying in this talk is kind of like a sphere, as you kind of go through the structures and then see through all the structures. And that's the integral. So let's have fun and talk about what is going on today. This is kind of like a work in progress, and this is sort of research for my book, which is going into this. It's called Passages from Tomorrow, and it's a time play idea. But I'm looking at contemporary examples and expressions of the integral through technology, through art, through music, etc. So what's going on today? If Gebser was alive today, what art would he be looking at? Because he would be looking at art. And this image particularly is kind of fun, and it's a kind of a riff on Mount Ventoux. It's not Mount Ventoux, but it's a lady standing on a mountain. But she's not really there. She's got a VR headset on, and so she's kind of experiencing the world as cave, because it's actually kind of, the way a map generates when you're in a three-dimensional space in a video game. It's a kind of encapsule around you. It's kind of like a cave wall where images are projected and things form and pop up in front of you. So there's a kind of interesting retrieval of the older structures in the present, and we're going to be seeing a lot of that. Electronic culture is not a term Gebser used. He wrote this in the 40s, but McLuhan did, and McLuhan wrote about that in the 60s and the 70s. And McLuhan was a media theorist, and he wrote about how he kind of described a very similar series of transformations of culture by studying the media of communication we were using, from oral culture and to the script culture, to the printing press, and now finally to the electronic culture, which relies on telephones and the internet and all sorts of stuff.
Today, I mean, there's just thousands of apps you can have on your phone also.
Yes.
Toward the electronic culture.
Yes, the cell phones and smartphones, and that's all just anything digital and electronic media. We're going to go into that a little bit if we have time. So electronic culture, it retrieves the mythical and the magical through the exteriorization of technologies. And Gebser did mention this a little bit in the 40s and 50s when he was writing this, that there's an interesting relationship between the between the magical and the mental. Both are concerned with kind of technologies or spells in which to manipulate and orient ourselves to the world and have some kind of power or relationship or survival with the world. For instance, the hunt, the magical ritual of the hunt. But to so magic and mythic also, magic is related etymologically to make and mechanic. So that, again, there's this kind of unconscious relation, and it's a whole other subject. But if you look at the history of new media and electronic culture and electricity, it's really spooky, and people are really quick to associate some of the terminologies of electricity with spiritism and spiritualism, with seances and all of this stuff. So there's a whole kind of electromagnetic imaginary we could get into. So I just want to say that as like the unconscious of modern technology, there's this kind of magical possession where it's almost as if by divorcing ourselves so much from the magical in the mental, it kind of comes back and possesses us with the technological consciousness.
That's mankind recreating itself outside of itself.
Yes, exactly.
It seems to be. I mean, that's the way it appears. And
Yeah, and a lot of this stuff is, the technologies, and this is always kind of the ongoing debate between, technologists who love this stuff and then certain esotericists who go, this is all a replacement for the subtle body. This is all kind of like a simulacrum of the astral, and
it's a reflection.
Yeah, but I think it's more of a kind of give and take, like you're saying. It makes you think back on these kind of things. But anyway, so there's a lot to cover here. So yeah, the domed cave is returned, and virtual realities are kind of opening us up to this kind of infinite, complex multidimensionality. Electronic culture also plays with time. Recording something for the first time, you're able to take, a voice from the 1930s and play it in this room, make it present. There's a kind of interesting time play going on. So that linearity of time begins to break up. And electricity itself is instantaneous in terms of how fast it moves across the world. It's nearly instantaneous in its speed. So it kind of disrupts space. And media studies always says this, and McLuhan always says this, that electronic culture, for once and for all, ended the importance of space. It was no longer important and a block to communication. So he's even expressing this kind of disruption of space in the integral, McLuhan. We'll get into that perhaps later, but there's foreshadowing of this with a lot of artistic movements like the cut-up method with William S. Burroughs and just playing with words and recording voices and sounds. And the present-day use of what they call combinatorial creativity, which is this idea of remixing and making art out of remixes. Here's just another interesting image of the cave, right?
Is that a man cave?
Practically. Now this is kind of fun, this part. There's a lot of interesting psychedelic spiritual guys and girls who go to Burning Man and take psychedelics and use the technologies to express what they're seeing and perceiving as psychonauts, as spiritual journeyers. So Android Jones is the guy who did this, and they created this microdose VR series. This is just a still from it, but kind of just imagine being in a space and having this whole thing surrounding you and seeing it in three-dimensionality as you're like looking around. So there's this kind of attempt in contemporary art to participate in the art again, to be in it, to be in these imaginal spaces, and we're doing it through technology. It's kind of a roundabout way to kind of retrieve the mythical.
When he gave the presentation the first time that I saw it at the Menace Center, he had guests coming from.
I had my good friend Nick Fuller, and
wow.
Yeah.
The frame before, you almost get a hint of the Hindu.
Yeah.
You can see that in replication, or what's the word?
Well, this is like very, contemporary, syncretic. I wouldn't exactly call it New Age. It is sort of new, but it's where to classify it. It's also called New Edge. It's kind of like psychedelic, psychonaut, consciousness culture. There's so many words for it now. What the young kids are doing.
And I'm sorry,
No, yeah. There's all sorts of syncretic
It offers a
images
cave for the youth to hide in. A very colorful one.
Yeah. Well, it offers the kind of imaginal cave to return, and this is sort of another example of that medium. As they're kind of going in, not with the VR headset, but they're still kind of experiencing the world as this domed enclosure, this imaginal enclosure.
But for those of us who may never experience virtual reality, what Jeremy's wife said recently, and then these other folks said, is you walk into this virtual reality and you really believe you're in it. And
it only takes you 30 seconds before your brain forgets that you're wearing a headset. Your brain is built for this. And the controllers, just as a side note, interestingly, and there's people who study this as a consciousness studies thing, the controllers that you use, it feels unnatural. Like, why would I use these little like clicky gun things? But if you're in it for a few minutes, you start to just feel like this is your hand, this is your appendage. It just begins to make sense. The weird globular hands that you have in VR suddenly become like, those are your hands. You want to protect your body. It becomes a kind of extended imaginal body in virtual reality.
It says a lot about our psyche and how
what
we
Absolutely.
What Natalie said was, you go in and you think of a spiritual tower, and you just keep building it higher and higher.
It's a very dangerous stage of consciousness. People can just stop there. And here in an anthroposophic perspective, we have a grand joining of both Lucifer and Ahriman. And as though Ahriman has secured the container, but Lucifer has kept them away from even realizing they're in that box.
And Ahriman would be the part of Satan that rules the electricity.
Ahriman being that part, yes.
There's an interesting relation between the sort of mineralogy of technology and the Ahrimanic, the underground materialism. But again, it's a combination of both, because there's this kind of Luciferian escape from reality, but it's also Ahrimanic in the sense that it kind of traps you. This is Steiner. This is completely this is a whole other working of the evolution, esoteric evolution.
And Ahriman are not all bad, right? I mean, there's the good and the
well, they're inherently detrimental to humanity. As we observe Steiner's 30-foot statue of Christ as representative of man, please keep a keen eye on his face and what he's doing to stay away from these two.
Well, Steiner saw
it's more than simply balance.
Steiner saw the Christ figure as a sort of pillar of these kind of extremities, but all of them are part of they make up reality, and they need to be here. They make up who we are. But just to kind of go into some more examples, contemporary examples. This is from The Invisibles. This is Grant Morrison. He's a comic book artist. He's an occultist. He's an esotericist, and he's certainly a psychonaut. He's had quite a trip.
I find just a brief moment to insert in that Steiner literally said, if Ahriman had his way, we would be crushed to dust.
Yeah, the archetypes doing their own thing.
Trying to help us.
So this is kind of what if we were going to continue to look at the artist as somebody who's attempting to express time. Grant Morrison had a kind of religious experience, and he wasn't on a psychedelic when this happened, at least. But he attempted to translate it into his comic books, and so here's a character who's become this kind of time worm, and is attempting to sort of express time, it's attempting to express movement through time in a similar way that the cave paintings and Lasseau sort of show this kind of shimmering movement. So, and of course you should know now that nothing begins nor does it end, things are ever present. So he's kind of really exploring this idea that time is this kind of higher dimensionality where you see past, present, and future together. And even the language here is kind of like non-linear, the way what she's trying to express to him, coming through and trying to tell him what reality really is.
If you'd given her a tripartite face, you'd have been all the way back to Picasso with color.
Yeah. So this is kind of, if we have a minute or two, I could read a little bit of this. It's just a passage from Grant Morrison's experience. He had a kind of, definitely more of a visionary experience. Gebser tends to be, I didn't really go into his biographical experiences, but they tend to be very subtle and beautiful in their kind of pristine simplicity, kind of a seeing through the world. But Morrison's a lot more, let's have fun and have this visionary state. So he describes himself, he says, "I was turned around," is the simplest way of thinking about it. I had fully entered a space that felt both vaulted and enclosed, like an immense cathedral, but also an infinite horizon. It was as if infinity and eternity could be contained and bottled inside something much bigger than both.
Key words describing Ahriman: contained and bottled inside.
Yeah. The space was profound azure blue in all directions, laced with bright silver lines and grid traceries that came and went. Ghost blueprints zipping up and down, an invisible monofilament scaffolding all around me. Stranger yet, my arrival in this place felt like a homecoming. All the cares and fears of the mortal world were gone, replaced by the hum of immaculate industry, divine creativity. I was a mercurial hypersprite too, and remembered that I had always been. There was time and space, but those were lower dimensions, useful for creating worlds in the same way that comic artists drew living worlds on paper. Here was an unending, perfect day of absorbing eternal creation. And he describes time now. He goes like, okay, so they tell him, these beings that he encounters in this altered state, tell him what time is. He says, they say time is a kind of incubator, and all life on Earth was one thing, a single weird anemone-like mega hydra with its single-celled immortal root in the Precambrian tides and its billion sensory branches, from ferns to people, with every single detail having its own part to play in the life cycle of a slowly complexifying, increasingly self-aware superorganism. It was as if I had been shown an infant god attached to a placental support system called Earth. I could see the shapes of things and of people as the late plane surfaces of far more complex and elaborate processes occurring in a higher dimensional location. Every human life became a trailing extension through time, not just four-limbed and two-eyed, but multi-limbed and billion-eyed. And again, it's that kind of time-worn expression. So this is his kind of visionary psychedelic state. But in it, he's attempting to express this kind of achronon in a kind of fun, intense, energetic way. And he tries to do that through his art. So, at any rate, there's a kind of, with art today, there's a kind of explosiveness, there's a kind of overwhelmingness, there's an overwhelming quality to the art. And I think it's because it's similar to Athena breaking out of the head of Zeus. Instead of breaking into space, we're breaking out of space and into this kind of multidimensionality. And I think our art's trying to reflect that complexity, this multidimensionality through our three-dimensional abilities. So this is Crisis on Infinite Worlds. It's a 1985 DC comic, but I just liked how it kind of expressed like these kind of multidimensionality of worlds, and it kind of also harkens back, you remember that image on Tutankhamun's tomb, this kind of interlinking of all things. It's kind of the rediscovery of that interlinking, but at a whole higher level. And Gebser didn't use the word spiral, but William Aaron Thompson does, and it's this idea that the older structures are kind of revisited as you move into the present integral structure in a completely different way, and they kind of break you open. Yeah, that's a good way. That's a good word for it. There's a kind of there's a kind of opening up rather than closing you down. It's not an escape or a retrieval to the ancient world as cave. It's a rediscovery that the cave is much more than we thought it was. So here's another image of this kind of head explosion. Android Jones as well, Forward Escape. It's a Tipper album, and musicians, of course.
Terminator 4.
And Archon Nair is another guy who's kind of exploring this idea. And again, there's this head motif, and I'm just looking at it as a kind of motif, and it's done a lot. It's done to the point where it can be cliche sometimes, but in other times there's a kind of spiritual energy of presence. There's a kind of understanding the self as multiplicity.
Who's this particular one?
Archon Nair, or Archon Nair.
I have to say that's my favorite.
And when you flash these, some of them, the ones with the faces, for some reason I think of New Orleans. You know, and because they have all that Creole and all that stuff going on.
Here we have Peter Max Jr.
This one is Archon Nair as well, and it's this kind of opening of the head and of the crown, the multidimensionality of the human being.
Archon doesn't sound like a name given at birth. Is this a group of people or a person?
It's one person. I don't know.
Okay. Would he have admittedly a Peter Max background or influence?
I'm not sure.
The colors evoke it.
Yeah. Interestingly, he doesn't take psychedelics.
The 60s. Yeah.
Yes, that's another whole other motif.
A lot of the art, I think.
Is he alive?
My son goes to a festival. Alex Gray.
Oh yeah, I wanted to not use Alex Gray for once because I use him all the time.
Israeli Gears cover.
But he was at that Symbiosis out
Yes.
there, and they had all the caves, if you will, to places they structures and stuff that they could go.
Yeah, he's a lot. The Chapel of Sacred Mirrors is quite a fun experience if you've ever been there in New York.
Love this stuff.
So these are musical examples. I don't know if we have time for any other videos.
No time or space in the spirit.
404.
I'm
do you
good
think?
for it.
Oh, yeah, we're
Everybody
on.
okay with it?
Okay, so
He may be getting more about integral theory too.
Let's get it.
Or maybe not.
maybe not. We'll see how much time we have. Literally. Speaking of linear time. So let's. So these are two things. There's two examples. I'm gonna play the first one this time instead of the other one. Let's see how it loads it. And there's an ad. Actually, I played that one already. Second one. Here we go.
George, I think we should listen.
So this is a fun little video by the artist, the musician Pogo. He's a digital artist, digital musician. And what he does is that kind of combinatorial creativity. He makes old films and kind of reanimates them in a kind of spiritual, energetic expression of the film. And he removes the need for words as words, and instead they're kind of sounds and intensities and qualities. And it's just a kind of fun remix, a kind of multidimensional object, like acoustic object, which I feel is a kind of expression of this integral time play, or the beginning of it at least.
Go very well.
Never give and then I'll never be. This sings songs, us sings this. Never give and then I'll never be. This sings songs, us sings this. Never gives and then I'll never be. This sings songs, us sings this. Never gives and then I'll never be. This sings songs, us sings this.
Of deep satisfaction.
I think he's kind of expressing like the mental rational here, the time, clocks. So that's Pogo, and this is a kind of an older video. But this just is an example, he's got so many others, of this kind of time play in art and music. And if I can find the mouse, where'd it go? Come out here, here we go. Here we go. Okay. So yeah, so we are confronted here with the eruption of the fourth dimension into three-dimensional world, in which it first outburst shatters the three-dimensional world. So this kind of shattering and breaking forth, this kind of psychedelic Zeus and Athena, breaking forth three-dimensional reality and moving us into the fourth dimension, and the art is kind of just playing with that mess. And there's a kind of messiness between the structures that Gebser also talks about in a stage of transition between these epochs. They're messy, they're dynamic, there's expressions of the old in the new and of the new in the old, and it's really hard to kind of delineate and put your finger and say, okay, this is the integral alone, because there's all sorts of stuff going on. For instance, electronic culture and digital technology as a technology in itself breaks reality into ones and zeros. It's the ultimate atomization. And there's even so much so that like Douglas Rushkoff has talked about this in his book Present Shock. It's this idea that there's a new type of time, but it's kind of like the ultimate anxiety-producing mental time where everything is immediately now and has to fit into now, and there's no longer any room for biological rhythm, and people are sleeping in all hours to get the kind of career they need. and that time is just on or off in digital. So there's problems with it, but at the same time, there's an amazing time play happening with it. So it can't be read as either or. It has to be read as this kind of multidimensional expression of the structures as the integral is trying to express itself and break through. And just as a couple examples, this is Interstellar, which plays with this theme as a kind of modern myth. Interstellar, I don't want to give any spoilers, but time is what this movie is all about, and this kind of multi-dimensional space to understand time is what the character kind of goes through and into, kind of like a modern-day 2001 Space Odyssey. And Arrival as well. Arrival is about this gift of time and this insight about how time and the nature of multidimensional time as past, present, and future is needed for this planetary consciousness to come online, this kind of interplanetary civilization to come online. So both of these myths these are stories that are trying to express this kind of fourth dimension erupting in the world. And to finally just close, the present work was written primarily for my generation, or so I thought, but the interest shown by the younger generation has become increasingly evident. The principal subject of the book, proceeding from man's altered relationship to time, is the new consciousness. And to this, those of the younger generation are keenly attuned. And to close with a poem, a line from Holderlin, behold, it is the eve of time, 1 hour when the wanderers turn toward the resting place. One God after another is coming home. Therefore, be present. And that's it. There's some footnotes if you like, but that's the talk. Questions, comments?
I want to say thank you for summarizing that into the most jam-packed hour and 45 minutes that my brain is going just like Android Jones.
It worked then.
Good, yeah.
Thank you.
Of course.
I see my Dennis might want to contribute something.
I just, you were about the last 10 minutes, just kept thinking that, for me, the summary of realizing that we're not in a cave, we're in a womb. And we keep thinking we're in a cave until we realize we're in a womb.
You know what? Woo.
Well, that makes fine a basis for truth, and as though the higher self treats everything, absolutely everything, with gratitude.
Yeah, that womb cave analogy is it's good. That's accurate. And that the slide just before the last one, he says he was identifying with the younger generation.
Yeah.
Now, when did he write that? Was that in the 40s?
That was in either the 40s,
Cool.
either 49 or 52, because the second edition came out.
That's still just as applicable today as
Yep.
it was then, if
It
not
is.
more so.
Yeah.
It's so important because to capture this new age generation, these indigos, to somehow get this information to them. I mean, they're ready for it. They're like sponges. They need it. And I think the videos that you showed, if these are ways of connecting to them, now,
Well,
Yeah.
Did you use the word undulating? No? Because it sort of describes it in this aromatic effect as it further permeates down and the effect into the nether region, so to speak, where we have these beautiful opulent caves that are technology. And there are those where Jung would join hands, and Jung did go to Steiner lectures, where Jung would join hands with him, and so there's this shadow portion of our higher development that's being brought forth through the pitch.
Well, you think of an adolescent boy going to his room in his little cave and playing with electronics. And I mean, they'll go in there. I mean,
There's
is that what
certainly higher purpose for the deeper we go.
For sure.
Now the adolescent boy goes to the room and plays basically a virtual game with players all over the world.
Well, that's a good point.
You know,
Yep.
and those.
That's the interesting thing, and that also is very similar to the magic in the sense that there's this kind of magical resonance and interconnectivity. There's a kind of collectivity that we're retrieving through electronic media and the internet. Facebook is a kind of hive mind, for better or worse. You know, there's nightmarish aspects to it, and there's beautiful ways to connect.
My daughter's 20, and she showed me in detail how they took games and specifically reprogrammed them to do different things. And from my perspective, this sort of uncontrolled explosion of electronics that we can take the control, or somewhat control, if you will, of our spirit and our heart to help direct us, or at least ask, is this pure?
It's where I'm gonna be.
Yeah.
With Facebook, we have the element of the societal, but the dangerous thing is things like World of Warcraft, where they're taken into this realm and they're not participating in the fellowship of man. In Facebook, we see gatherings fostered like this, where we actually go out into the outer world and participate with one another. But there are the arch nemesis of that is the gaming world, where they're sucked into it. They lose their outer world contact.
But
Well,
at the same
I
time,
would say that there are other worlds, and part of the definition of the magic and the mythic was this ability to become entranced with alterity and to be into other dimensions and to develop subtle bodies that can travel through other worlds. So, I mean, if you're going to take that kind of perspective. So we're kind of doing that with games, and as a gamer, I'm it's fine, and we're learning how to participate. Our stories are becoming things that we become a part of with these kinds of video games. There are problems and there are traps, for sure. Just as there are traps in the imaginal and the
Does that prevent us from entertaining humanity at large, though?
Yeah, I mean, there are like nation states. There are games the size of nation states where anthropologists are studying what gamers are doing as they kind of fight each other through this kind of miniaturization of history across like economic systems. It's just kind of it's interesting, and we learn from it. I don't know if it's necessarily
It provides an
all good.
escapism without a real tenet to ethos.
Well, there's more to it than escapism. They're exploring the unconscious reflections of what is within, only projected out.
And
They
the
really are
rainbows.
travelers in the new world. I mean,
Mhm.
you're discovering those things. I've got a lot to say for gamers. I think they're really onto something.
Mhm.
Yeah, you can become absorbed in it all the time and maybe disappear, but at the same time,
Yeah,
it's just like everything else. There's a
and I gotta plug World of Warcraft as this player. I used to play for a couple years.
That's probably why someone tried
I
You look up at your clock and 3 days have passed. It's like, whoa.
I also have to say that the rainbows and the crystals and the, what's the other one?
Butterflies.
Butterflies. Indigos, the few that I know, I mean, are literally having trouble staying sane because they have so much stuff coming in. And I'm not talking about just this world. I mean, I'm talking about people who are spiritually connected, like some of the people in this room, but I mean, it's overwhelming to them.
Well,
So,
what is saying?
and so when I see those pictures of the brains, I think of some of my friends, you
Yeah,
know?
I think it's expressing what we're experiencing as this.
But they need to find grounding, and
Yeah.
it's hard.
Well,
It's difficult.
The internet and the psychedelic revolution combined has got today's world.
Yeah.
I mean, it's bringing it
Well,
out.
yeah.
It's going to change everything.
Part of like
You guys just need to go silent for a moment.
Okay, we'll go silent.
Jeez.